Maya, sweetie, tell everyone what you're doing these days, my father said across the dining room table, his voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness that made my stomach clench. And I knew exactly what was coming, because I'd heard this tone 100 times before, the one that pretended to be interested while setting up the punchline that would make everyone laugh at my expense. I was 18 years old, sitting at the far end of the table in my parents' house, surrounded by aunts and uncles and cousins who had gathered for what was supposed to be a celebration dinner for my younger sister Vanessa, who had just been accepted to Stanford Medical School, and somehow every family gathering for the past 2 years had become another opportunity to remind me of exactly how much I had disappointed them all. "I'm working," I said quietly, knowing it wouldn't be enough, that nothing I said would ever be enough for him. "Working," my father repeated, and he actually laughed, this sharp bark of amusement that made my Aunt Rosa look up from her wine glass with interest. "Two minimum wage jobs, living in that closet she calls an apartment, because she decided college wasn't for her." My mother didn't even look at me, just kept cutting her chicken into smaller and smaller pieces, and I wondered if she was embarrassed of my father's cruelty or embarrassed of me, though I already knew the answer. Vanessa sat directly across from me in the seat of honor, wearing a Stanford sweatshirt that my mother had bought her the day the acceptance letter arrived. And she wasn't quite smiling, but there was something in her eyes that looked an awful lot like satisfaction. "Not everyone is cut out for higher education," my Uncle Marco offered, trying to be diplomatic but somehow making it worse. "Maya probably just needs to find her path, maybe community college eventually." My grandmother shook her head slowly, this gesture of profound disappointment that I felt like a physical weight. "In my day, children didn't throw away opportunities," she said to no one in particular. "They understood sacrifice, understood what their parents worked for." I sat there feeling invisible and hypervisible at the same time, wanting to disappear but unable to move. And I thought about the laptop in my car, about the lines of code I'd been writing until 3 in the morning, about the healthcare management platform that I'd been building for the past 18 months that was finally starting to work the way I'd envisioned it. They had no idea. Not one single person at this table knew that I'd taught myself Python and JavaScript, that I'd identified a critical inefficiency in patient intake systems, that a senior developer named Marcus at Mercy General Hospital had seen something in my work and had been mentoring me for over a year. "At least we have one daughter who will make something of herself," my father said, raising his glass toward Vanessa, and everyone else raised their glasses too, and I sat there with my water because I was still too young for wine, and somehow that felt symbolic of everything else, being excluded even from the casual rituals of family celebration. That night, sitting in my car in their driveway before driving back to my studio apartment across town, I made myself a promise. They would see. Eventually, they would all see exactly what I was capable of, and I wouldn't have to say a single word to prove it. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. It started 2 years earlier, on a Saturday morning in June, when I sat my parents down at the kitchen table and told them I wasn't going to college, and I watched my father's face turn from confusion to anger to something that looked almost like hatred in the span of about 30 seconds. "What do you mean you're not going?" he demanded, and my mother started crying immediately. Not the quiet kind of crying, but the loud, gasping kind that made me feel like I was physically hurting her with my words. I tried to explain that I had a plan, that I wanted to work in healthcare and learn technology, that I could teach myself skills that college wouldn't give me. But my father cut me off with a hand gesture so sharp, it might as well have been a slap. "You're throwing your life away," he said. And those words became the refrain of the next 2 years, repeated so many times in so many variations that I sometimes heard them in my sleep. Vanessa, who was 16 at the time, and already taking AP classes and volunteering at hospitals, and building the perfect college application, sat on the stairs, and watched the whole thing with this expression of superiority that I can still see perfectly when I close my eyes. My mother kept saying, "What will people think?" over and over, and I realized that her tears weren't really about me or my future, but about how my decision reflected on her, about what she would tell her sisters and her friends at church and the neighbors who always asked about her daughters. The next few months were brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. When Vanessa got accepted to Berkeley for undergrad, there was a party with extended family, with a cake that said, "So proud," in blue frosting, with my father giving a speech about excellence and dedication. I wasn't in any of the family photos from that day. I was there, standing in the corner of the living room, but when my Aunt Rosa was taking pictures, my mother literally positioned herself and Vanessa and my father in a tight grouping that had no space for me, and I stood there watching them smile for the camera and pretended I needed to check something in the kitchen so I wouldn't cry in front of everyone. I got a job as a medical assistant at Mercy General Hospital, working 40 hours a week for $16.50 an hour, and I rented a studio apartment in a neighborhood my mother called dangerous, even though it was just working class and diverse. I bought a used laptop with my first paycheck and started teaching myself to code using free online resources, staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning, watching tutorials and building practice projects. My family didn't visit my apartment, not once in 2 years. My mother told her sister Elena that we only have one daughter in school when I overheard them talking at a family birthday party, and when I walked into the room, they both went quiet in that way that made it clear they'd been talking about me. I stopped being invited to things. My cousin's quinceañera, my uncle's anniversary party, Sunday dinners that had been a tradition since I was a child. Suddenly, I wasn't on the invite list, and when I asked my mother about it, she said, "I didn't think you'd want to come since you're so busy with work." But her tone made it clear that the real reason was that I was an embarrassment, a cautionary tale. The daughter who made bad choices and refused to listen to wisdom. What my family didn't know was that while they were measuring success in acceptance letters and medical school rankings, I was building something real in the small hours between my two jobs, something that started almost accidentally when the hospital's IT department came to our floor to install new patient intake software that was supposed to streamline our work, but actually made everything slower and more complicated. I was working as a medical assistant at Mercy General, taking vitals and updating patient charts, and doing the kind of work that my father would have called glorified secretary if he'd bothered to ask about it, and I watched the nurses and doctors struggle with this expensive new system that crashed constantly and required 17 steps to do what used to take 3. There was this moment, about 6 months into my job, when I was staying late to help Mrs. Chen, one of the night shift nurses who was in her 50s and struggled with technology, and she was nearly in tears because the system had lost a patient's medication history, and she said, "There has to be a better way to do this." And something clicked in my brain. I went home that night to my studio apartment with its Murphy bed and its single window that looked out onto a parking lot. And instead of sleeping, I started researching healthcare management software, reading articles about workflow optimization and user interface design, terms I barely understood but couldn't stop learning about. I taught myself Python first, using free resources from MIT's OpenCourseWare and YouTube tutorials, and a determination that felt almost desperate, like if I could just learn this one thing, then maybe I wouldn't feel so worthless. Maybe I could prove that my decision to skip college wasn't the disaster my family believed it was. 6 months later, I'd built a rough prototype of a patient intake system that solved the problems I saw every day at work, and I showed it to Marcus Williams, a senior software developer who was consulting on another hospital IT project and who I'd worked up the courage to approach in the cafeteria one day with my laptop and my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. Marcus was 43, had worked in healthcare technology for 15 years, and he looked at my amateur code with this expression I couldn't read, and I was certain he was going to tell me it was garbage, that I should stop wasting my time. Instead, he said, "This is actually solving a real problem. and he asked if I wanted to meet weekly to improve it, and that was how I got a mentor when my own family had written me off completely. For 18 months, I worked my 40-hour weeks at the hospital, picked up weekend shifts doing medical billing from home to pay rent, and spent every remaining hour coding, testing, rebuilding, learning database architecture and cloud integration and cybersecurity protocols that healthcare systems required. Marcus never charged me for his time, meeting me every Thursday evening at a coffee shop near the hospital where we'd sit for hours while he reviewed my code and taught me professional development practices and told me stories about other unconventional paths into tech. My best friend Kiara, who I'd met during a medical billing training and who worked 3 jobs to support her younger siblings while her mother battled cancer, was the only other person who knew what I was building. And she'd bring me food when I forgot to eat and let me sleep on her couch when I was too exhausted to drive home after coding all night. I was surviving on maybe 5 hours of sleep, living on rice and beans and whatever free food I could get from the hospital cafeteria, watching my savings account hover around $200 while I poured everything into this platform I was calling MediFlow, and my family had no idea, because they never asked what I did with my time, never visited my apartment, never showed even the slightest curiosity about my life. The breaking point came in March, 2 years after I'd left home and stopped being considered a real member of the Torres family, when Vanessa finished her undergraduate degree at Berkeley with honors and got accepted to Stanford Medical School with a full scholarship, and my mother decided to throw a celebration dinner at Lucia's, an expensive Italian restaurant downtown where the cheapest entree cost $40 and where our extended family had celebrated major milestones for as long as I could remember. I found out about the dinner from my Aunt Rosa, who called me by accident thinking she was calling my mother, and when she realized her mistake, she got flustered and said, "Oh, Maya, I thought, well, I'm sure your mother was going to tell you about it." But her tone made it clear that no, my mother had not planned to tell me, that I was not on the guest list, that this celebration of my sister's achievements was not meant to include the family embarrassment. I showed up anyway, wearing the nicest clothes I owned, which was a black dress I'd bought at Target 3 years ago, and shoes that pinched my feet because I'd bought them half a size too small when they were on clearance. And when I walked into the private dining room, where 25 members of my extended family were already gathered around a long table decorated with white flowers and gold balloons that said, "Congratulations, Dr. Torres," even though Vanessa wouldn't technically be a doctor for another 4 years, the room went quiet in that terrible way that made my skin feel too tight. My mother saw me, and her face did this complicated thing where surprise and annoyance and something that might have been shame all fought for dominance, and she said, "Maya, I didn't think you'd be interested since you don't value education." And she said it loud enough that everyone heard, loud enough that my grandmother nodded in agreement, and my Uncle Carlos looked down at his plate. I sat in the empty chair at the far end of the table, the only seat that hadn't been set with silverware because it wasn't meant to be filled, and I watched my family celebrate my sister with a kind of adoration that felt religious. Watched my father stand up with a glass of wine and give a toast about how proud he was to have a daughter who would save lives, and the way he emphasized the word "a daughter" made it clear he meant one daughter, the only one who mattered, and I sat there feeling invisible and small and so angry I could barely breathe. Vanessa gave a speech thanking everyone for their support, talking about the sacrifices our parents made, the encouragement she received, the family values that shaped her success, and she didn't look at me once, not even a glance of acknowledgement that I existed, that we'd grown up in the same house, that I was her sister. I left before dessert, mumbling something about work in the morning that no one really listened to, and I drove back to my studio apartment with tears blurring my vision and my hands shaking on the steering wheel, and I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to calm down before I could go inside. That night, at 11:47 p.m., I received an email that would change everything. An email from Dr. Patricia Morrison, CEO of Mercy General Hospital Network, with the subject line, Mediflow pilot program proposal, and I read it 3 times before I could believe what I was seeing. They wanted to test my platform across 5 hospitals in a 3-month pilot program, with a trial contract worth $250,000 and the potential for full implementation across their entire network if the pilot succeeded. The email from Dr. Patricia Morrison sat in my inbox like a door to another life. A door I was terrified to walk through because what if I failed? What if my platform didn't work at scale? What if I proved my family right, that I was nothing more than a girl with delusions who should have just gone to college like everyone expected? But I called Marcus at midnight anyway, my voice shaking as I read him the email, and he was quiet for a long moment before he said, "Maya, this is what we've been working toward for 18 months. This is real." And hearing him say it made it feel possible. The next morning, I took a personal day from my medical assistant job and met Marcus at a coffee shop downtown, where we spent 6 hours going through the proposal line by line, the technical requirements and implementation timeline, and the money, $250,000 for a 3-month pilot program across 5 hospitals in the Mercy General Network, with the possibility of a full implementation contract worth $2.3 million if the pilot succeeded, numbers so large I couldn't quite process them as real. Marcus helped me draft a response that sounded professional and confident, even though I felt like an imposter, and he insisted we negotiate the contract terms, asking for milestone payments instead of payment on completion, building in support clauses and intellectual property protections that I never would have thought of myself. 2 weeks later, after 3 video conferences with Dr. Morrison and the hospital board, where I presented technical demonstrations and answered questions about scalability and security protocols, I signed the pilot program contract with hands that shook so badly I could barely hold the pen. And when the first payment of $85,000 hit my bank account 3 days later, I sat on my apartment floor and cried because I'd never seen that many zeros attached to my name before. I knew immediately that I'd have to quit my medical assistant job to focus on implementation full-time. A terrifying decision, because what if the pilot failed and I had no job to return to and no money, and my family's worst predictions about my future came true? But Marcus convinced me that I couldn't do this halfway, that this opportunity required everything I had. My family didn't know about any of this because they never asked about my life, but I ran into my father completely by chance. 3 days after I'd quit my job, bumped into him at a Starbucks near his office where he was meeting a client, and when he saw me, he looked almost surprised that I existed, asked what I was doing in this neighborhood, and I said I'd quit the hospital to do freelance software work. He laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Freelance means unemployed, Maya. You know that, right?" And his client looked uncomfortable, but my father just shook his head like I was a child who didn't understand how the world worked, and he didn't offer to buy me a coffee even though I was standing in line and he'd just walked past me to his table like I was a stranger he'd exchanged pleasantries with out of obligation. I ordered my coffee and left and sat in my car in the parking lot, thinking about that $85,000 in my account and the contract that would change my life. And I made a decision right then that I wouldn't tell my family anything, that I would let them keep believing I was a failure, right up until the moment I proved them catastrophically wrong. The 3 months of implementation were the hardest work I'd ever done in my life. 16-hour days that started at 6 in the morning and didn't end until I fell asleep at my laptop past midnight, managing a small remote team of 3 developers I'd hired with part of the contract money, coordinating with hospital administrators who were skeptical that a 20-year-old could solve problems their expensive consultants hadn't fixed, debugging systems in real time while doctors and nurses watched and judged, proving myself over and over again in a male-dominated tech space where hospital IT directors twice my age questioned every decision I made and asked if I had a supervisor they could speak with instead. I missed meals and survived on coffee and protein bars, lost 8 pounds I couldn't afford to lose, developed insomnia from the stress of knowing that if this pilot failed, I'd have nothing, no job to return to, no credibility, just debt from the team I'd hired, and my family's satisfied certainty that they'd been right about me all along. Meanwhile, my sister's Instagram was a constant parade of success that I couldn't stop myself from checking, even though every post felt like a knife. Vanessa in her white coat with the Stanford Medical School logo, Vanessa with her study group looking exhausted but accomplished, Vanessa celebrating her residency match with our parents at another expensive dinner I wasn't invited to, each post flooded with comments from our relatives praising her dedication and intelligence and promising future. My mother shared every single post to her own Facebook with captions like, "My daughter, the future doctor," and "So proud of my girl." And once, "Blessed to have a child who makes all the sacrifices worth it." And that one made me close my laptop and cry in my apartment bathroom for 20 minutes before I could go back to work. I wasn't in any family group chats, wasn't included in the thread where they planned Vanessa's birthday celebration or discussed Thanksgiving dinner, and I found out I wasn't invited to Thanksgiving only when my Aunt Rosa posted photos of the family gathered around my parents' table, 23 people including cousins I barely knew, and I sat alone in my apartment that Thursday, working on a critical system update that couldn't wait while my entire family celebrated without me. Kiara's family saved me that evening, her mother calling at 7 p.m. to insist I come over for leftovers, and her father hugging me at the door saying, "Our table always has room for you." And I sat with her loud, warm, chaotic family and felt more loved in 2 hours than I'd felt with my own family in 2 years. And when Kiara's little brother asked me what I did for work and I explained about the hospital software, Kiara's mother said, "That's incredible, Maya. You should be so proud." And I realized those were words my own mother had never said to me, not once in my entire life. The metrics came in during week 11 of the pilot program, delivered to my inbox at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning while I was debugging a system integration issue that had kept me up until 3 a.m., and when I opened the spreadsheet attached to Dr. Morrison's email, I had to read the numbers 3 times before they felt real because my platform had reduced patient check-in times by 60% across all 5 hospitals, decreased administrative errors by 75%, and according to the hospital network's financial analysis, saved them approximately $1.4 million in the first quarter alone through improved efficiency and reduced redundancy. Dr. Morrison called me personally that afternoon, her voice warm with genuine enthusiasm as she said, "Maya, the board met this morning and the vote was unanimous. We want to move forward with full implementation across the entire network, and we'd like to discuss expansion into our affiliated clinics." And I sat in my apartment with my phone pressed to my ear, trying to process that this was actually happening, that I had succeeded beyond even my own optimistic projections. The formal contract negotiations took 2 weeks, and Marcus sat with me through every video conference with the hospital's legal team and financial officers, helping me understand terms like perpetual licensing and maintenance agreements and intellectual property rights. And when the final contract landed in my inbox, it was worth $2.3 million for comprehensive implementation with ongoing annual licensing fees projected at $500,000. Numbers that would make me a millionaire before my 21st birthday. Numbers I couldn't quite connect to my own life because they seemed like they belonged to someone else's story. The hospital board wanted to announce the partnership publicly, and Dr. Morrison suggested a press release and a small ceremony to celebrate the innovation, and I agreed while a plan began forming in my mind, a plan that felt both petty and absolutely necessary because my family still didn't know about any of this, still believed I was unemployed and directionless, still excluded me from their group chats and family dinners and casual Sunday phone calls. I hadn't told them because part of me wanted to see how long they could continue ignoring my existence, how long they could maintain the fiction that I was the family failure while Vanessa was the only child worth acknowledging. And another part of me was waiting for the right moment, the moment when the truth would be undeniable and public and impossible to dismiss. 3 days after signing the implementation contract, I received another email, this one from Riverside Health System, a competing hospital network that had heard about my pilot program's success and wanted to make an offer for their own implementation, $3.1 million for a comparable system across their facilities. And I forwarded it to Marcus with shaking hands because having two major hospital networks competing for my platform meant I had created something genuinely valuable, something the healthcare industry actually needed. My phone rang constantly with congratulations from the team I'd hired, from hospital administrators I'd worked with during implementation, from a reporter at Healthcare Technology Review who wanted to interview me about being a 20-year-old founder disrupting hospital operations, and through all of it, my family remained completely oblivious, posting on social media about Vanessa's residency orientation and my mother's book club and my father's golf tournament without a single mention of my name, as if I had never existed at all. My mother's phone call came on a Wednesday afternoon in late February, 3 months and 2 weeks since the last time we'd spoken, and I saw her name on my caller ID while I was in a meeting with a potential investor, and almost didn't answer because I had trained myself not to expect anything from her except disappointment or silence. But something made me excuse myself and take the call in the hallway where her voice came through tight and formal saying, "Maya, I'm calling to let you know your father is having surgery next week. He's been diagnosed with a heart condition, and they're putting in 2 stents. The surgery is scheduled for Tuesday at Mercy General, and I thought you should know in case you want to try to come." And the way she said try to come, as if my attendance was optional, as if I might be too busy with my nothing life to show up for my own father's surgery, made something twist in my chest, even as I registered the name of the hospital and felt the universe's cruel sense of irony settle over me like a weight. I asked if he was okay, if the condition was serious, and my mother's voice softened slightly as she explained that the doctors were optimistic, that it was a relatively routine procedure, but still surgery, still risk. And then she added, "I know you're busy with your computer stuff or whatever it is you do, but it would mean something to your father if you came." And the dismissiveness in her voice when she said computer stuff told me that she still had no idea, still believed I was unemployed or working some meaningless job that didn't warrant explanation or interest. I told her I would absolutely be there, that of course I'd come, and she actually sounded surprised, saying, "Oh, well, that's good. The surgery is at 7 a.m., so we'll be there early. You don't have to come that early if it's difficult." Still assuming that anything I might have going on in my life couldn't possibly be important enough to prioritize, and I felt the plan beginning to form in my mind, even as I stood in that hallway holding my phone and feeling the familiar ache of being treated as an afterthought in my own family. I called Marcus as soon as I hung up, and when I told him where my father's surgery was scheduled, he let out a low whistle and said, "Maya, that's either the worst coincidence or the universe giving you a gift." And I knew he was right, because my father would be recovering in a hospital running my software, surrounded by systems I had built, and my family would walk those halls completely oblivious to the fact that I had transformed the very institution they were depending on to save his life. Dr. Morrison and I had already been discussing the public announcement of our expanded partnership, and when I called her that afternoon and asked if we could coordinate the ceremony with the week of my father's surgery, possibly the day after since he'd be recovering there anyway, she immediately understood what I wasn't quite saying and agreed with warmth in her voice, telling me she'd make it work and that my family deserved to see what I'd accomplished. The week between my mother's phone call and my father's surgery moved with strange dual momentum, crawling through anxious moments when I checked my phone compulsively for updates on his condition, while simultaneously accelerating through a series of professional milestones that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier when I'd announced I wasn't going to college and watched my family's respect evaporate in real time. On Thursday morning, I sat in my apartment with Marcus on video call as we reviewed the final implementation contract, $2.3 million for comprehensive deployment across the entire Mercy General network, with ongoing annual licensing fees projected at $500,000. And when I signed the digital document, my hand trembled slightly because this made everything official, made me a millionaire 3 months before my 21st birthday. made me successful by any objective measure, even though my family still believed I was unemployed and directionless. The Riverside Health System offer sat in my inbox like a safety net I didn't need, but appreciated anyway. $3.1 million dollars for a comparable implementation, and having two major hospital networks competing for my platform felt surreal in a way I couldn't quite process, because I'd built Mediflow in my tiny studio apartment while surviving on ramen and coffee, teaching myself to code after 12-hour shifts as a medical assistant, and now executives in corner offices were negotiating million-dollar contracts for access to something I'd created from nothing. By Friday afternoon, media coverage started appearing in healthcare technology publications. A piece in Healthcare Innovation Review with the headline, 20-year-old founder disrupts hospital operations, and another in MedTech Today describing me as the youngest healthcare software CEO to secure a major hospital network contract. And I read these articles 3 times each, trying to reconcile the person they described with the daughter my mother couldn't be bothered to call except to inform me about family emergencies. Dr. Morrison emailed me Saturday morning with confirmation that the public announcement ceremony was scheduled for Wednesday at 2 p.m. in the hospital's main atrium, the day after my father's Tuesday surgery, and she wrote, I've invited local business media and several hospital board members from other networks who've expressed interest in your platform. This will be significant coverage, Maya. Are you ready? And I typed back yes, even though I felt terrified and exhilarated in equal measure, because this would be the moment my family couldn't look away, couldn't dismiss me, couldn't pretend I didn't exist. Kiara drove me to 3 different stores on Sunday, looking for the right outfit. Something professional enough to command respect, but not so formal. I looked like I was trying too hard, and we finally found a navy blue suit with clean lines and a silk blouse in cream that made me look competent and successful, and nothing like the family disappointment my relatives had decided I was. And when I tried it on, Kiara actually teared up, saying, Maya, you look like the CEO you are. Your family is going to lose their minds. And I smiled but felt my stomach twist with nerves because part of me was still that 18-year-old girl at the dinner table being mocked for choosing a different path. Marcus called me Monday evening, with a warning delivered in his characteristically direct way. Maya, I need you to be prepared for however your family reacts. They might be proud, or they might be defensive, or they might try to take credit somehow, and you need to go into this with boundaries already established in your mind about what kind of relationship you're willing to rebuild with them. And I knew he was right, but I also knew that some part of me still desperately wanted my parents to be proud, still wanted my mother to look at me the way she looked at Vanessa, still wanted my father to introduce me as his daughter without shame or qualification. And I hated that I wanted these things because I'd worked so hard to build worth independent of their validation. I arrived at Mercy General Hospital at 6:15 on Tuesday morning, 45 minutes before my father's scheduled surgery, and the building rose in front of me like a monument to everything I'd built while my family wasn't watching. Every floor running systems I'd designed, every department using workflows I'd optimized, every screen displaying interfaces I'd coded in my tiny studio apartment during those endless 18 months when my parents couldn't be bothered to ask what I was actually doing with my life. The surgical waiting area on the 4th floor was already populated when I stepped off the elevator carrying a travel mug of coffee and wearing jeans and a simple sweater, because I was here as a daughter today, not as a CEO, though the distinction felt increasingly artificial as I spotted my family clustered in the far corner of the room and felt the familiar tightening in my chest that came from preparing myself for their indifference. My mother sat with her hands folded in her lap, looking exhausted and worried, my grandmother beside her wearing an expression of grim determination, my 2 aunts, Teresa and Linda, whispering to each other with the urgent intensity of people who needed constant activity to manage anxiety, my Uncle Robert reading something on his phone, and Vanessa standing slightly apart from the group wearing her residency scrubs like armor, the fabric printed with the name of her hospital in letters visible from across the room, and I knew without asking that she'd chosen to wear them deliberately, to remind everyone that she was the medical professional in the family, the daughter who'd made the right choices. I walked toward them, and my mother glanced up, registered my presence with a small nod that contained no warmth or relief, and said, "Oh, you made it," in a tone that suggested mild surprise that I'd managed to show up on time. And my grandmother looked at me over her reading glasses and made a sound somewhere between acknowledgement and dismissal before returning her attention to my mother. Vanessa gave me a quick once-over and said, "Hey," without moving from her position or showing any intention of making space for me in their circle. And my aunts paused their conversation long enough to offer tight smiles before resuming their whispered conference about my father's condition and the competence of the surgical team. And I realized with clarity that even here, even on a morning when our family was gathered because my father's heart was failing, I was still peripheral, still optional, still the daughter who didn't quite count. I took a seat 3 chairs away from the main family cluster, far enough to give them space, but close enough to hear updates. And my Aunt Teresa glanced over and said, "Maya, your mother said you're doing some kind of computer work now. Is that keeping you busy?" And the question was asked with the patronizing kindness people use when they're trying to show interest in something they consider fundamentally unimportant. And I responded, "Yes, I stay pretty busy," without elaborating. Because what was the point of explaining when they'd already decided my work was meaningless? My grandmother made that sound again, the one she'd perfected over decades that communicated disappointment without requiring actual words, and said to no one in particular, but clearly intending me to hear, "At least one of you girls made something of herself." And her eyes moved to Vanessa with unmistakable pride. And Vanessa had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, but didn't contradict her, didn't say anything to suggest that maybe I deserved respect too, just accepted the compliment like she'd been accepting them her entire life while I stood in shadows wondering what I'd done wrong besides choosing a different path. A nurse appeared with a clipboard calling Torres family, and we all stood, and she explained that my father had been taken back to pre-op, that the surgery would begin within the next 30 minutes, that the procedure was expected to take approximately 3 to 4 hours, and that the surgeon Dr. Khalid would come speak with us immediately afterward, and my mother asked questions in a voice tight with stress about risks and recovery times, while Vanessa nodded along with professional understanding, and my grandmother gripped her purse with white knuckles, and I stood at the back of our small group feeling like a stranger attending someone else's family emergency. After the nurse left, my mother turned to me suddenly, as if just remembering I was there, and said, "Maya, I should have asked, are you still doing that computer hobby thing, or did you find a real job?" And the way she said hobby thing made it clear she believed I was unemployed, or working retail, or doing something temporary and embarrassing. And I felt Marcus's warning echo in my mind about being prepared for their reactions, about establishing boundaries, and I said as calmly as I could manage, "Yes, Mom, I'm still doing my computer work." And she nodded with an expression that conveyed polite disinterest mixed with faint concern that I wasn't taking my life seriously. And Vanessa added, "At least you're doing something, I guess," in a tone that managed to be both encouraging and condescending simultaneously. And I sat back down without responding because tomorrow everything would change, and I just needed to get through the next 24 hours without revealing anything before the ceremony. I opened my laptop to review some documentation for tomorrow's announcement and almost immediately noticed hospital staff members walking past our waiting area, some of them glancing in my direction with recognition in their eyes. And I realized that several of them had been in implementation meetings with me over the past 3 months, had worked directly with me on system integration and training, and I watched them carefully to make sure none of them approached me or said anything that might give away my identity before I was ready for that revelation. And one nurse who'd been particularly helpful during the emergency department rollout caught my eye and smiled warmly before continuing down the hall. And I felt grateful that the staff seemed to understand discretion, even if they probably had no idea why I was sitting in this waiting room, pretending to be just another anxious family member. The first hour passed with agonizing slowness, my laptop screen displaying code documentation I'd reviewed 100 times already, but which gave me something to focus on besides the weight of my family's indifference pressing against me from 3 chairs away, and my Aunt Linda broke the silence by asking, Maya, what are you working on that's so important you need to do it here? With genuine curiosity mixed with faint disapproval that I wasn't sitting with my hands folded in anxious solidarity like everyone else. And I looked up and said, just work stuff, nothing urgent. Because how could I explain that reviewing technical specifications for tomorrow's announcement ceremony was the only thing keeping me from either screaming or crying? And my Aunt Teresa leaned forward with that particular expression of forced interest people use when they're making conversation to pass time and said, what kind of work do you do exactly? We've never really understood what you're up to. And before I could answer, Vanessa interjected with, she does computer stuff, like coding or whatever, in a tone that made it sound equivalent to a hobby someone might take up to fill empty hours. And my grandmother made that dismissive sound again and said, in my day, young women became teachers or nurses, real professions where you help people. And the implication that my work was neither real nor helpful hung in the air like smoke. And I felt my jaw tighten, but forced myself to respond calmly. I do data systems work, mostly healthcare related, which was technically accurate while revealing absolutely nothing about the scope or significance of what I'd built. My mother was staring at her phone, refreshing something compulsively, probably a medical app tracking surgery progress. And without looking up, she said, Maya, is that paying enough to live on, or are you struggling? Because if you need help, you should just say so, instead of being proud. And the assumption that I must be barely surviving financially made something twist in my chest, because in my bank account sat the first payment from the pilot contract, $125,000, that I'd stared at for 10 minutes when it appeared, because I'd never imagined having that much money at once, and I said, I'm managing fine, Mom. You don't need to worry about me, which was perhaps the understatement of my entire life. But she just nodded absently and returned to her phone. Around the 90-minute mark, I noticed activity near the nurses' station. And then Jennifer Michaels, one of the hospital administrators I'd worked closely with during the emergency department implementation, came walking down the corridor carrying a tablet and reviewing something intently. And I felt my heart rate spike because Jennifer knew exactly who I was and what I'd built, and if she said anything now, it would ruin tomorrow's carefully planned revelation. And I watched her approach our waiting area with growing panic, and then she looked up from her tablet and her eyes met mine, and I saw recognition flash across her face, followed immediately by a warm smile, and she changed direction and walked directly toward me saying, Ms. Torres, I didn't expect to see you here today. Is everything all right? And my entire family's attention snapped to this interaction with the sudden focus of people desperate for any distraction from waiting. And I stood up quickly, hoping to keep the conversation brief, and said, Hi, Jennifer. Yes, everything's fine. My father is having surgery this morning. And she touched my arm with genuine sympathy and said, I'm so sorry. I hope it goes well. And please tell him he's in excellent hands. The surgical team here is outstanding. And then she added, the team upstairs wanted me to thank you again for that quick fix you did yesterday on the pediatric intake module. You saved us from a significant workflow problem. And I felt my family's collective stare boring into my back like physical pressure and managed to say, Of course! Happy to help. I'll see you tomorrow at the ceremony. Which was perhaps too revealing. But Jennifer nodded enthusiastically and said, I'm so excited for tomorrow's announcement. It's going to be wonderful recognition for everything you've accomplished, before saying goodbye and continuing down the corridor. And I sat back down in silence so profound it felt like the air itself had thickened. My mother spoke first, her voice careful and confused. Maya, how do you know that woman? And I kept my eyes on my laptop screen and said simply, I do some consulting work here at the hospital, which was true in the barest technical sense, though it described my role the way calling the ocean damp describes water. And Vanessa leaned forward with sudden sharp interest and said, What kind of consulting? Like IT support? Like you fix computers? And the dismissiveness in her assumption that I must be doing something entry-level and technical made me want to laugh. Except nothing about this moment was actually funny, and I said, something like that, and refused to elaborate further, even as I felt their questions pressing against me, demanding more explanation. And my Aunt Linda said to my mother in a voice that wasn't quite a whisper, "I didn't know Maya had a real job. I thought she was just doing freelance odds and ends." And my mother nodded slowly, looking at me with new assessment, as if seeing me for the first time. And Vanessa said directly to me with that particular edge that came from feeling off balance, "Why didn't you ever mention you were working at Mercy General? That's actually pretty impressive." And the fact that she found it impressive only because it was a prestigious hospital and not because of anything I'd actually accomplished made me want to scream, but instead I just shrugged and said, "It never came up," which was a generous way of describing the fact that nobody in my family had asked me a single substantive question about my life in over a year, and the tension in our small section of the waiting room became so palpable that my grandmother actually suggested someone should go get coffee, just to have something to do. At 3:45 in the afternoon, exactly 3 hours and 48 minutes after my father had been wheeled into the operating room, the surgical waiting area intercom crackled to life and announced that the Torres family could proceed to the recovery area on the third floor, and we gathered our belongings in silence, thick with relief and residual anxiety, my mother clutching her purse against her chest like a shield, my grandmother moving slowly with her cane, Vanessa leading the way with the confident stride of someone who belonged in medical facilities. And I followed at the back of our small procession, feeling like an afterthought, even in this moment that should have united us. The recovery area was quieter than the surgical floor, divided into semi-private bays separated by pale blue curtains, and a nurse with kind eyes and graying hair, pulled back in a neat bun, directed us to Bay 7, where my father lay on a reclined bed, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him, his normally robust frame diminished by hospital gowns and medical equipment, an IV line running into his left arm, monitoring wires disappearing under his gown, his face pale and waxy in the fluorescent lighting, and my mother rushed to his side immediately with a small cry that was half relief and half continued fear, taking his hand carefully as if he might break from too firm a touch. My father's eyes were open but unfocused, the anesthesia still clouding his awareness, and he looked at my mother without quite seeming to recognize her for a moment, before clarity slowly returned to his expression, and he managed a weak smile and said something too quiet for me to hear from my position near the curtain. And Vanessa moved to his other side to check his vitals with professional efficiency, even though the nursing staff was perfectly capable of monitoring him. But she needed to feel useful and important and medical in this moment. And my grandmother took the single chair positioned near the foot of the bed, while my aunts and uncle clustered in the small space remaining, and I stayed pressed against the wall near the entrance to the bay, feeling like an intruder at someone else's family gathering. A few minutes later, Dr. Liao Khalid entered the bay carrying a tablet and wearing surgical scrubs with that particular combination of exhaustion and satisfaction that comes from a procedure gone well, and he was a tall man in his mid-50s with silver threading through his dark hair and an air of competent authority that immediately commanded attention, and he greeted us warmly and said, "Mr. Torres came through beautifully. The valve replacement was textbook, no complications, and I expect a full recovery with proper rehabilitation." And my mother actually sobbed with relief, while Vanessa asked detailed questions about the specific procedure and post-operative protocols, in a tone that suggested she was a colleague rather than a daughter, and Dr. Khalid answered her patiently while occasionally glancing at his tablet to reference surgical notes. Then, Wow. Khalid said something that made my heart stop. "I have to say, this new patient management system you have here at Mercy General made the entire preoperative process incredibly smooth. We cut our prep time nearly in half, and the coordination between departments was seamless. Whoever designed this system is a genius because it's transformed our surgical workflow." And he said this casually, as a side comment not intended to be particularly significant. But I watched Vanessa's posture straighten with pride, as if this compliment was somehow directed at her, as if her status as a medical resident meant she could claim credit for hospital innovations by association, and my mother nodded as though she understood the technical significance of what he was describing, even though I knew she had no idea what patient management systems were or how they functioned, and my aunts murmured appreciative sounds about modern medical technology. My father, still groggy from anesthesia, but more alert than he'd been minutes earlier, turned his head slightly on the pillow to look at me directly for the first time since I'd arrived at the hospital that morning, and his eyes focused on my face with what seemed like genuine recognition, and he said in a voice rough from intubation, "You came," which was not "thank you for being here," or "I'm glad you're here," or even "hello, Maya." Just a simple statement of fact, acknowledging my presence as if it was unexpected or notable that I'd bothered to show up for my own father's major surgery. And I felt something twist in my chest, but managed to say, "Of course I came, Dad," even though we both knew there had been years of family events and celebrations and gatherings where I hadn't been invited or had been deliberately excluded, and my mother glanced at me briefly, with an expression I couldn't quite read before returning her full attention to my father and beginning to fuss with his blankets and adjust his pillows with the nervous energy of someone who needed to feel like she was helping. Dr. Khalid finished his explanation of post-operative care, prescribed pain medications, physical therapy requirements, and the timeline for recovery, which would keep my father in the hospital for approximately 3 to 4 days before discharge, and then he left to check on other patients, and my family settled into the recovery bay with the clear intention of staying for the extended visiting hours. And I pulled out my phone to check the time and saw 3 text messages from Dr. Morrison, the most recent one reading, "All set for tomorrow at 2 p.m., media confirmed, board members attending. This is going to be a wonderful event." And I felt my pulse quicken, because in less than 24 hours, everything would change. This entire dynamic would shatter, and my family would finally see what I'd built while they were busy pretending I didn't exist. I was composing a response to Dr. Morrison when my mother looked over at me with mild irritation and said, "Maya, can you put your phone away? Your father just had major surgery." As if my checking a text message was somehow disrespectful to his recovery, and I slid the phone into my pocket without responding, because explaining that I was confirming details for a multi-million-dollar contract announcement would only invite more questions I wasn't ready to answer yet. And Vanessa caught the interaction and said to me with that particular tone of sisterly superiority, "Some of us know how to be present for family emergencies instead of being glued to our phones," which was rich coming from someone who'd spent the entire morning in the surgical waiting area posting Instagram stories about being at the hospital in her residency scrubs. But I bit back the response because tomorrow would provide all the responses I'd been storing up for years. My father drifted in and out of sleep over the next hour, the anesthesia gradually wearing off but leaving him exhausted, and during one of his more alert moments, he looked around at all of us gathered in the small recovery bay and said with surprising emotion, "My family, all here." And my mother squeezed his hand, and my grandmother reached over to pat his leg, and Vanessa said, "We wouldn't be anywhere else, Dad." And everyone nodded in agreement with this touching family solidarity, and I remained silent because I was thinking about all the times I hadn't been included in family events, all the times my presence had been optional or unwanted, all the times they demonstrated through actions and words that I wasn't really part of this unit they were celebrating, and the irony of this moment was so sharp it felt like physical pain. Around 6:30 that evening, after my father had been moved from the recovery bay to a private room on the cardiac care floor with a window overlooking the hospital's central courtyard and a more comfortable setup for the extended stay ahead of him, a young hospital staff member knocked softly on the door and entered, carrying a cream-colored envelope embossed with the Mercy General logo, and she was perhaps 23 or 24, with her dark hair pulled into a neat ponytail and wearing the teal scrubs that identified her as patient services staff, and she smiled apologetically for the interruption and said, I'm sorry to disturb you, but I have an invitation for the Torres family. And she held out the envelope toward my mother, who was sitting in the recliner chair beside my father's bed, and my mother took it with a puzzled expression and said, "An invitation? What for?" With the slight edge of suspicion she applied to unexpected things, and the staff member explained, "The hospital is hosting a special recognition ceremony tomorrow afternoon in the main atrium. It's celebrating a major partnership announcement, and since Mr. Torres is a patient here during this time, we thought your family might like to attend." And my mother looked down at the envelope as if it might explain itself further, before carefully opening it and pulling out a heavy cardstock invitation printed with professional formatting that announced a ceremony scheduled for 2 o'clock the following afternoon in the hospital's main atrium to recognize a significant advancement in healthcare technology partnership. My mother read the invitation aloud slowly, her voice carrying the confusion she clearly felt. The Mercy General Hospital Network cordially invites you to attend a special ceremony recognizing innovation in healthcare technology and announcing an expanded partnership that will transform patient care across our facilities. Thursday, November 16th at 2 p.m. in the main atrium. Reception to follow. And she looked up at the staff member and asked, "Why would they invite us specifically? Is this something all patient families receive?" And the young woman shook her head and said, "It's a selective invitation. The ceremony is open to hospital staff and special guests. But we're inviting certain patient families who are here during this significant moment in our hospital's history," which was a diplomatic way of saying that Dr. Morrison had specifically requested my father's name be added to the invitation list because she knew exactly what impact it would have. And I felt my heart hammering in my chest as I stood near the window, pretending to look at the courtyard view, while actually watching my family's reaction in the reflection on the glass. Vanessa leaned over from where she'd been sitting on the small couch against the wall, checking her phone, and said, "Let me see that," and took the invitation from my mother's hands to examine it herself. And after a moment she said, "This sounds like it might be some kind of PR event. Hospitals do these things when they're rolling out new technology or announcing major donations. It might actually be interesting to see what kind of innovations they're implementing," with the tone of someone who considered herself qualified to assess medical technology advancements by virtue of her residency status. And my Aunt Linda said, "Should we really attend something like this when your father just had surgery? Won't it be too tiring for him?" But my father, who was more alert now than he'd been in the recovery bay, though still clearly exhausted and dealing with significant pain despite the medications, said, "I'm fine. If it's just downstairs in the building, we should go. Might be interesting to see what the fuss is about." And my mother nodded in agreement and said, "It's tomorrow at 2. We were planning to be here visiting anyway. We might as well attend since they've invited us." And she set the invitation on the small table beside my father's bed, where it sat like a ticking time bomb that only I could hear. I cleared my throat and said with careful casualness, "I'll be here tomorrow afternoon, too." And my mother glanced at me with mild surprise and said, "You're coming back tomorrow. Don't you have work or something?" And I said, "I can make time to check on Dad, and I'll probably attend that ceremony too if I'm here anyway." And Vanessa looked at me with slight suspicion, perhaps picking up on something in my tone or simply unable to imagine why I'd voluntarily spend more time at the hospital than absolutely necessary, and she said, "You're really interested in hospital technology announcements?" with an emphasis that suggested this was beyond my comprehension level. And I just shrugged and said, "It might be interesting," while thinking about how in less than 20 hours I would be standing at a podium in front of these people explaining exactly how interesting my work had been. My phone buzzed in my pocket and I pulled it out to see a text from Dr. Morrison reading, "Invitation delivered. Everything is set for tomorrow. The media confirmed attendance and the board is very excited. This is going to be a wonderful recognition of your achievement." And I typed back quickly, "Thank you for everything. See you tomorrow at 1:30 for final prep," and slid the phone back into my pocket before anyone could ask who I was texting. And my mother, who had seen me checking my phone, said with that familiar irritation, "Maya, you're always on that phone. What's so important that it can't wait? And I said, just confirming some work stuff for tomorrow, which was perhaps the most honest thing I'd said to my family in months, though they had no idea what kind of work I was confirming. And Vanessa muttered something under her breath about people who couldn't be present in the moment. And I let the comment slide off me because I was thinking about tomorrow. About the moment when everything would change, about the looks on their faces when they finally understood what I'd built while they were busy dismissing me as the family failure. I woke up at 5:30 on Thursday morning in my studio apartment after barely sleeping 3 hours, my mind racing through every possible scenario for what would happen in less than 9 hours. And I lay in bed staring at the ceiling where the early morning light was just beginning to filter through the thin curtains, and thought about all the moments that had led to this day. Every dismissive comment and cruel exclusion and casual cruelty that had accumulated like stones in my chest, and I felt simultaneously terrified and exhilarated because today everything would change and there would be no going back from this moment. I forced myself out of bed and went through my morning routine with mechanical precision, showering and carefully doing my makeup with more attention than usual, wanting to look professional and polished and completely in control, even though my hands were shaking slightly as I applied mascara and tried 3 times to get my eyeliner even. The navy blue suit I'd bought with Kiara 2 weeks ago hung on the back of my closet door, still wrapped in dry cleaning plastic, and I took it down carefully and laid it on my bed, running my fingers over the fabric and thinking about how this suit cost more than I used to make in 2 weeks as a medical assistant, but was worth every penny because it represented who I'd become rather than who my family thought I was. My phone started buzzing at 6:15 with messages of support. Marcus sent, "Today's your day, kid. You've earned every bit of this. Knock them dead." And Kiara sent a string of heart emojis followed by, "I'm so proud of you I could burst. Go show them who Maya Torres really is." And there were emails from business contacts who'd seen the press release that would go out this afternoon about the expanded contract, and even a message from Dr. Morrison saying, "See you at 1:30 for final prep. You're going to be wonderful. This is a moment you'll remember forever." I made coffee with hands that wouldn't quite steady and stood at my small kitchen counter drinking it while looking around my studio apartment that had been my sanctuary for the past 2 years. This space that my family had never visited because they'd never asked to see where I lived or cared about this part of my life that existed separate from their disappointment in me. And I thought about how soon I'd be able to afford a bigger place, maybe even a house. But this apartment represented something important about who I'd become when I had to build myself without their support or approval. At 7:30, I got dressed with ceremonial care, the suit fitting perfectly and making me look older and more authoritative, and I stood in front of my full-length mirror and barely recognized myself because I looked like a CEO and a successful businesswoman and someone who commanded respect, not the family disappointment who was pitied at gatherings and excluded from photos. I arrived at Mercy General at 8 o'clock, earlier than I needed to, but unable to stay away, and I went up to my father's room on the cardiac care floor, still wearing my professional suit, carrying my laptop bag and a folder of materials for the ceremony. And when I walked into his room, my entire family was already there, which surprised me because visiting hours had just started and I hadn't expected them this early. My father was sitting up in bed looking significantly better than he had yesterday evening, the color returning to his face and his eyes clearer, though he still moved carefully and had monitoring equipment attached to him. And my mother was arranging flowers that someone had sent in a vase on the windowsill, and Vanessa was sitting on the small couch scrolling through her phone in her civilian clothes rather than her residency scrubs. And my grandmother was in the recliner chair with her cane propped beside her. And everyone looked up when I entered, and their expressions went through identical progressions of surprise at seeing me so early, and then confusion at how I was dressed. Vanessa recovered first, and said with that familiar edge of condescension, "Why are you dressed like that? Did you have a job interview or something?" and I could hear in her tone the assumption that I was probably applying for administrative positions, or perhaps trying to upgrade from whatever freelance computer work she assumed I was doing, and I said calmly, "I have a meeting this morning at the hospital," which was technically true, though it failed to capture the magnitude of what that meeting actually was. And my mother turned from the flowers and looked me up and down with an expression that managed to convey both skepticism and something almost like concern, and she said, "A meeting here. Are you interviewing for a hospital position? Because I should tell you that getting hired at a place like Mercy General is very competitive, and they usually want people with college degrees for anything beyond entry-level work." I felt the familiar sting of her automatic assumption that I wasn't qualified for anything significant, her casual certainty that my lack of traditional education limited me to the lowest rungs of any professional ladder. But instead of letting it wound me the way it would have even 6 months ago, I just smiled slightly and said, "I'm not interviewing, I'm preparing for this afternoon's ceremony." And my grandmother perked up and said, "Oh, that's right, that technology announcement thing. Are you going to that, Maya?" And I nodded and said, "Yes, I'll definitely be there." And Vanessa said, "It's nice that you're interested in healthcare innovation, even if you're not in the medical field yourself. These kinds of events can be educational," with that particular tone that suggested she was complimenting a child for showing curiosity about adult topics. My phone buzzed in my suit pocket, and I pulled it out to see a text from Marcus reading, "Media setup confirmed, board members arriving at noon. Dr. Morrison wants to run through your speech one more time at 1:30. This is really happening." And I typed back, "I'm at the hospital now. See you at 1:30. And when I looked up, my mother was watching me with slight irritation and said, "You're checking your phone again. Who are you texting this early in the morning?" And I slid the phone back into my pocket and said, "Just coordinating details for this afternoon," which made Vanessa laugh slightly and say, "Details? What kind of details would you need to coordinate for attending a hospital ceremony?" With genuine curiosity, mixed with that constant undercurrent of dismissiveness. And I just shrugged and said, "Work stuff," which was perhaps the understatement of my entire life. I stayed in my father's room for another 20 minutes, making small talk about his recovery and his pain levels, and when he might be discharged. And he looked at me several times with what seemed like curiosity about my appearance, and finally said, "You look very professional, Maya, all dressed up like that." And I said, "Thank you, Dad." And those might have been the kindest words he'd said to me in 2 years, and I felt an unexpected twist of emotion in my chest, because part of me still desperately wanted his approval, even though I'd built everything I'd accomplished without it. At 9 o'clock, I excused myself, saying I needed to prepare for my meeting, and as I was leaving, I heard my aunt whisper to my mother, "She seems different somehow, more confident maybe." And my mother's response was too quiet for me to hear, but I imagined it was something dismissive about how confidence didn't pay bills or substitute for education. I went down to the administrative wing, where Dr. Morrison's office was located, and found her already there despite the early hour. And when I walked in, she stood up from her desk and came around to greet me with genuine warmth and said, "Maya, you look absolutely perfect, professional and polished and ready to show everyone what you've accomplished." And I felt my eyes prick with unexpected tears, because this woman who was the CEO of a major hospital network and had decades of experience and multiple degrees believed in me and respected me in a way my own family never had. We spent the next hour reviewing logistics for the ceremony, where I'd stand before being called up, how the AV team would coordinate the presentation slides with my speech, when media would be allowed to ask questions, and Dr. Morrison walked me through every detail with patient thoroughness and kept saying things like, "You've earned this recognition, and your work has genuinely transformed our operations." And each compliment felt like medicine for wounds I hadn't fully acknowledged I was carrying. At 10:30, I went to the main atrium where the event would take place and found the facilities team already setting up chairs in neat rows facing a raised platform with a podium and a large screen for the presentation. and the space was being transformed from a regular hospital atrium with its fountain and plants and natural lighting into a professional venue suitable for a major announcement. And I stood at the back watching the setup and thinking about how in less than 4 hours I would stand at that podium and tell my story and watch my family's understanding of who I was completely shatter. I found the women's restroom on the second floor near the administrative offices and locked myself in a stall for 10 minutes. Not because I needed to use it, but because I needed a private space to have a small controlled breakdown before pulling myself together. And I sat on the closed toilet seat and put my face in my hands and let myself feel everything I'd been holding back. The fear that I'd mess up the speech, or that somehow this wouldn't go the way I'd planned. The anger at years of dismissal and cruelty. The grief for the family relationships that should have been supportive but weren't. The almost unbearable anticipation of the moment when everything would change. When I emerged from the bathroom, my eyes were slightly red, but I'd reapplied my makeup and straightened my suit, and I looked at myself in the mirror and said out loud to my reflection, "You built something extraordinary. You changed healthcare operations across 5 major facilities. You negotiated a multi-million-dollar contract before your 21st birthday, and you did all of it while they were busy pretending you didn't matter, and today they're going to see exactly what you're capable of." And my reflection looked back at me with determination that felt real and earned and powerful. At exactly 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, I stood at the side entrance to the main atrium, watching as the last attendees filed in and took their seats. And the space had been completely transformed from this morning into a professional venue that looked like it could host a corporate product launch or a major media announcement, with approximately 150 chairs arranged in neat rows facing the raised platform, where a sleek podium stood centered in front of a massive screen that currently displayed the Mercy General Hospital Network logo, and the lighting had been adjusted to create a more formal atmosphere while still maintaining the atrium's natural brightness from the glass ceiling 3 stories above. And I could see hospital staff members I recognized from implementation meetings scattered throughout the audience, alongside board members in business suits and several people with cameras and recording equipment who were clearly media representatives. And toward the middle of the seating area in the 5th row, I spotted my family settling into their chairs with expressions ranging from mild curiosity to confusion about why this event seemed so much larger and more significant than they'd anticipated. My mother was wearing the navy dress she reserved for important occasions, and she kept looking around at the professional setup with visible bewilderment. And Vanessa sat beside her in casual clothes since she wasn't on shift today, and my father was in a wheelchair that a hospital aide had brought down from his room because he'd insisted on attending, despite Dr. Morrison's suggestion that he might want to rest, and his face still showed the pallor and exhaustion of someone recovering from major surgery, but his eyes were alert and taking in the scene. And my grandmother was on his other side, leaning on her cane, with my Aunt Linda beside her. And I watched them whisper to each other and gesture at the media presence and the formal staging, and I knew they were trying to understand what kind of hospital event required this level of production. I was standing in the side corridor near the administrative offices, where I had a clear view of the atrium, but was hidden from the audience's sight, and I was wearing my navy suit with my hair styled and my makeup carefully applied, and I was holding my note cards for my speech, even though I'd memorized every word, because having them in my hands made me feel more secure. And my heart was pounding so hard I could feel the pulse in my throat, and my hands were cold despite the warm temperature in the building, and I kept taking slow, deep breaths the way Marcus had taught me during our practice sessions. Dr. Morrison appeared beside me at 1:55, looking impeccable in a charcoal gray suit with her silver hair styled elegantly, and she put a warm hand on my shoulder and said quietly, "This is your moment, Maya. Everything is ready, and you're going to be absolutely wonderful. Just remember to breathe and speak slowly, and let yourself feel proud of what you've accomplished." And I nodded because I didn't trust my voice not to shake, and she smiled with genuine affection and said, "I'll give you a signal when it's time to come up. You'll be standing right here, and when I say your name, you'll walk straight down that side aisle to the stairs on the left side of the platform. And once you're at the podium, just focus on the back wall if looking at the audience feels overwhelming. And then she squeezed my shoulder once more and walked out into the atrium, and I heard the audience noise quiet as she approached the podium. Dr. Morrison's voice came through the sound system, clear and authoritative, as she said, "Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for what I believe will be remembered as a landmark moment in Mercy General's history. We're here to celebrate innovation and partnership and the kind of forward thinking that transforms healthcare delivery." And I watched from my hidden position as she commanded the room with the ease of someone who'd given thousands of speeches, and she continued. As many of you know, Mercy General Hospital Network has always been committed to providing not just excellent medical care, but to embracing technological advancement that improves patient outcomes and operational efficiency. And over the past several months, we've been piloting a revolutionary software platform that has exceeded every expectation we had when we began this partnership. And the screen behind her came to life, showing the MediFlow Systems logo that I designed 18 months ago in my studio apartment, and my breath caught seeing it displayed so prominently. Dr. Morrison clicked to the next slide, which showed statistics and clean infographics. In just 3 months of pilot implementation across 5 of our facilities, this platform has reduced patient check-in times by 60%, decreased administrative errors by 75%, improved care coordination between departments by 80%, and saved our network approximately $1.4 million in operational costs. And I heard murmurs of impressed surprise ripple through the audience, and I could see my family in their row leaning forward slightly to see the screen better, and Vanessa was actually paying attention now instead of checking her phone, and Dr. Morrison let the statistics sink in before continuing. These are not projections or hopeful estimates. These are actual measured results from real-world implementation in our busiest facilities. And the feedback from our staff has been overwhelmingly positive, with nurses and administrators telling us this system has transformed their daily workflow in ways they didn't think possible. I felt Marcus appear beside me in the corridor, and he didn't say anything, but just stood there as a supportive presence. And I glanced at him, and he gave me a thumbs up and mouthed, "You've got this," and then turned his attention back to Dr. Morrison's speech, and I was grateful he was there because knowing I wasn't completely alone in this moment made it feel slightly less terrifying. Dr. Morrison advanced to another slide, showing testimonial quotes from hospital staff members. "Listen to what our team members are saying. This system has cut my administrative time in half and let me focus on actual patient care," says Jennifer Wu, head nurse in our cardiac care unit. And Robert Chen, an emergency department administrator, reports, "I was skeptical at first, but this platform has eliminated bottlenecks I thought were just inevitable parts of hospital operations." And we have dozens more testimonials like these from staff across all 5 pilot facilities. And she paused to let that impact register before saying, "Based on these extraordinary results, I'm thrilled to announce today that Mercy General Hospital Network is moving forward with full implementation of this platform across all 12 of our facilities, representing a partnership investment of $2.3 million with ongoing licensing agreements that will make this system an integral part of our operations for years to come." The audience broke into applause, and I saw board members nodding to each other with satisfaction. And my family was clapping too, though they still looked somewhat confused about why they'd been invited to witness this announcement. And my mother leaned over to say something to Vanessa that I couldn't hear, but I imagined it was something about how impressive it was that the hospital was investing in technology. And Dr. Morrison waited for the applause to fade before continuing with what I knew would be the turning point of the entire ceremony. Dr. Morrison's expression shifted into something warmer and more personal as she said, "But technology is only as powerful as the vision behind it, and this platform exists because of one person's unique perspective and determination." And she paused for effect while advancing to a new slide that showed a photograph I'd submitted last week of myself standing in front of the original whiteboard where I'd mapped out the first version of Mediflow's architecture, and she continued. This platform was designed by a young innovator who saw problems in our healthcare system that others had accepted as inevitable and decided to create solutions. Someone who spent 18 months teaching herself advanced software development while working full-time in healthcare and observing firsthand the inefficiencies that frustrated both staff and patients. And I watched my mother lean forward in her seat, squinting at the screen, trying to see the photograph more clearly. And Vanessa had finally put her phone down completely and was actually paying attention now that Dr. Morrison was telling what sounded like an inspirational underdog story, and my grandmother was nodding along as if she appreciated the narrative of hard work and determination. And none of them had yet made the connection between the young innovator being described and the daughter and sister and granddaughter they'd dismissed for 2 years. Dr. Morrison's voice took on an even more impressed tone as she said, in just 3 months of pilot implementation, her software has transformed our operations across 5 facilities, and the results have been so extraordinary that we received a competing offer from regional healthcare partners for $3.1 million to implement her platform in their network instead. And I heard surprised murmurs ripple through the audience, because that was information we'd kept confidential until now, and she smiled and continued. But we moved quickly to secure this partnership because we recognized that this kind of innovation doesn't come along often. And today we're announcing a full network implementation contract valued at $2.3 million, with expansion plans already in development for additional modules that will further streamline our operations. And the audience broke into enthusiastic applause, and I could see board members looking very satisfied with this announcement. And my family was clapping along politely, but I could see confusion on their faces about why they'd been invited to witness this corporate partnership announcement. And my mother leaned over to say something to my father in his wheelchair, and he shook his head slightly as if he didn't understand either why a hospital staff member had specifically brought them an invitation to this event. Morrison waited for the applause to fade, and then said with genuine warmth in her voice, I'd like to invite the creator of this transformative technology to the stage to share her journey and her vision for the future of healthcare management. And she gestured toward where I stood, hidden in the side corridor, and I felt my heart rate spike to what felt like dangerous levels. And she continued, she's not only a brilliant software developer, but also someone who understands healthcare from the inside because she worked as a medical assistant while building this company, and at just 20 years old she's already changing how major hospital networks operate. And my family was still clapping politely and looking toward the main entrance, expecting some young professional they'd never met to walk in. And Vanessa was craning her neck to see who would appear, and my mother had that expression she got when she was preparing to be impressed by someone else's accomplished child. And Dr. Morrison smiled broadly and said in a voice that carried clearly through the sound system, Please welcome Maya Torres, founder and CEO of Mediflow Systems. And I watched as my family's polite applause faltered and stopped mid-clap as their brains processed the name they'd just heard. And my mother's face went through a rapid series of expressions, from confusion to shock to something like disbelief. And Vanessa's mouth actually fell open, and her phone slipped from her hand onto her lap. And my father's eyes went wide, even in his post-surgical exhaustion, and my grandmother turned to my Aunt Linda with an expression of complete bewilderment. And I took a deep breath and stepped out from the side corridor into the main atrium and began walking down the side aisle toward the platform stairs, exactly as Dr. Morrison had instructed me to do. And I kept my eyes focused straight ahead on the podium because I knew if I looked directly at my family in that moment, I might lose my composure entirely. The walk down that aisle felt simultaneously like it took hours, and like it happened in less than a heartbeat, and I was hyper-aware of every sound in the atrium, from the rustle of programs to the whisper of shocked conversation that was beginning to ripple through the audience as people processed what they were seeing, and I kept my eyes focused on Dr. P's. Morrison standing at the podium with an encouraging smile on her face, because I knew if I looked directly at my family's section, I would see expressions that might break my concentration entirely, and my legs felt shaky, but I kept walking with my shoulders back and my head up the way Marcus had coached me to do. And when I reached the stairs at the left side of the platform, I gripped the railing perhaps harder than necessary and climbed the 3 steps to stage level and crossed to the podium where Dr. Morrison was waiting with an outstretched hand. She shook my hand firmly with genuine warmth and leaned close to whisper, "You're going to be wonderful," before stepping aside and yielding the microphone to me. And I set my note cards on the podium surface, even though my hands were trembling enough that the cards rattled slightly against the wood. And I looked out at the audience of approximately 150 people and saw faces I recognized from implementation meetings and board presentations, and some I didn't recognize who must have been media representatives. And I allowed myself one quick glance at my family's section in the 5th row, and what I saw there almost made me lose my composure completely because my mother's face had gone absolutely white and her hand was pressed to her chest as if she was having trouble breathing, and Vanessa was staring at me with an expression of complete disbelief, like she was witnessing something that violated the fundamental laws of physics. And my father in his wheelchair looked stunned and confused and almost frightened, and my grandmother's mouth was hanging open, and my Aunt Linda had grabbed her arm as if for support, and I tore my eyes away from them and focused on the back wall of the atrium and took a breath and began to speak. Thank you, Dr. Morrison, for that incredibly generous introduction, and thank you to everyone here today for taking time to celebrate this partnership. And I was relieved that my voice came out steady and clear, even though my heart was racing so fast I could feel it pounding in my ears. And I continued. 2 years ago, I was working as a medical assistant at a different hospital, and every single day, I watched healthcare professionals struggle with systems that seemed designed to create inefficiency rather than prevent it. I watched nurses spend hours on administrative tasks that pulled them away from patient care. I watched scheduling conflicts and communication breakdowns that could have been avoided with better technology. And I started asking myself why nobody had solved these problems. And I clicked to advance the presentation slide, which showed a photograph of a typical hospital administrative station with stacks of paperwork and multiple computer screens. And I said, the answer wasn't that nobody had tried. It was that most healthcare management software is designed by people who've never actually worked in healthcare. They're building solutions to problems they don't fully understand, which is why so many hospital systems are clunky and counterintuitive and actually create more work instead of reducing it. I could see people in the audience nodding in recognition, and I felt a tiny bit of my nervousness ease as I realized these were people who understood exactly what I was talking about. And I continued. So I decided to teach myself software development. I spent 18 months taking online courses and reading technical documentation and building prototypes and testing them and rebuilding them. I worked my medical assistant shifts during the day and coded at night and on weekends. And I was fortunate enough to connect with an incredible mentor. And I gestured to where Marcus sat in the 3rd row, and he raised his hand in a small wave, and I said, Marcus Chen believed in this project before it was anything more than sketches on a whiteboard, and he taught me not just technical skills, but how to think about scalable systems and user experience design. I clicked to the next slide, which showed the MediFlow interface with its clean, intuitive dashboard, and I began walking through the technical features, explaining how the platform integrated with existing hospital systems and automated workflow coordination and created real-time communication channels between departments. And I was in my element now, talking about something I knew inside and out, and I explained, the key innovation isn't any single feature. It's that the entire system was designed by someone who actually worked in healthcare and understood the daily frustrations of the people who would be using it. Every decision about interface design and automation priority came from real-world observation of what healthcare workers actually needed. And the audience was paying close attention now, several people taking notes. and I could see my family in my peripheral vision still frozen in their seats, like they'd been turned to stone. I clicked to the next slide, which showed a bar graph comparing the pilot program metrics to industry standards, and I said, the results from our 3-month pilot program exceeded even our most optimistic projections. Patient check-in times decreased by 60%, administrative errors dropped by 75%, and the hospital network saved approximately $1.4 million in operational costs in just the first quarter. And I watched the audience react with impressed nods and murmurs, and I continued. But more importantly than the financial metrics, we heard from healthcare workers that they were finally able to spend more time on patient care and less time fighting with administrative systems. We heard from patients that their hospital experiences were less stressful and more coordinated, and we saw measurable improvements in patient satisfaction scores across all 5 pilot facilities. And I clicked again to show a video testimonial from a nurse at one of the pilot hospitals who described how Mediflow had transformed her daily workflow. And I let the video play for 30 seconds before fading it out and saying, these results caught the attention of other healthcare networks. And I want to be transparent about the fact that we received a competing offer from regional healthcare partners for $3.1 million to implement Mediflow in their system instead of expanding with Mercy General. And I saw Dr. Morrison smiling because we'd agreed I would mention this, as it made our partnership seem even more valuable, and I continued. But we chose to stay with Mercy General because Dr. Morrison and her team believed in this project when it was just a prototype. They took a chance on a 20-year-old with no college degree and no corporate experience. And that kind of faith and partnership matters more than a higher dollar amount. And the Mercy General staff in the audience looked genuinely moved by this, and several board members were nodding approvingly. I advanced to a slide that showed headshots of my small team, and I said, I also want to acknowledge the incredible people who helped build this, my development team who worked ridiculous hours to meet our implementation deadlines, our user experience designer, who made sure the interface was intuitive for people with varying levels of tech comfort, and especially Marcus Chen. And I gestured to him again and said, Marcus saw potential in me when I was just a medical assistant who asked too many questions about the hospital's IT systems. He mentored me for 18 months without any guarantee that this project would succeed. He taught me everything from advanced database architecture to how to present to hospital boards, and none of this would exist without his guidance and belief. And Marcus had tears in his eyes and mouthed, proud of you. And I had to pause for a second to collect myself before continuing. I clicked to a slide showing Kiara's photograph and I said, and my best friend Kiara Williams, who supported me through every single moment of doubt and exhaustion, who brought me food when I forgot to eat because I was coding for 12 hours straight, who told me I could do this even when I was absolutely certain I couldn't, and who's sitting in the front row crying right now. And Kiara laughed through her tears and wiped her face, and the audience made warm, appreciative sounds. And I felt my confidence growing as I realized I was almost through the prepared remarks, and I hadn't completely fallen apart. I clicked to the final slide, which showed the Mediflow logo and a tagline that read, Healthcare Technology Designed by Healthcare Workers, and I took a breath and said, I'm grateful to everyone who believed in me when I chose an unconventional path, when I decided that traditional education wasn't the right route for me, and that I could learn what I needed to learn and build something meaningful without a college degree, when I trusted my own observations and instincts even when others couldn't understand my choices, and I let my eyes move deliberately to where my family sat frozen in their seats, and I held eye contact with my mother for just a moment before continuing. Because the truth is that there are many paths to success and contribution, and the most important thing is finding the path that lets you use your unique perspective and skills to solve real problems. And my voice was steady, but I knew my family could hear the pointed message in those words, and I concluded, I'm excited to continue this partnership with Mercy General, to expand Mediflow to all 15 hospitals in the network, and to keep building technology that makes healthcare workers' lives easier and patients' experiences better. Thank you all for being here today. And the audience erupted into enthusiastic applause that felt like it went on forever. And Dr. Morrison stepped forward to shake my hand again, and the board members stood up, which prompted a standing ovation. And I stood there at the podium with my hands shaking and my heart pounding, and tears threatening to spill over as I finally let myself look fully at my family's section, where my mother sat with her face in her hands, and my father stared at me with an expression of complete shock, and Vanessa looked like her entire understanding of reality had just been fundamentally challenged, and I knew in that moment that everything had changed forever. The moment Dr. Morrison concluded the formal program and thanked everyone for attending, I was immediately surrounded by people who seemed to materialize from every direction, and the carefully maintained composure I'd held during my speech began to crack slightly as hospital administrators I'd worked with during implementation shook my hand and told me how proud they were, as board members introduced themselves and talked about expansion opportunities, as two different reporters asked if I had time for a quick interview, and I tried to be present for each conversation while simultaneously being hyper-aware of my family standing in a tight cluster about 15 feet away, clearly unsure whether they should approach or wait, or possibly just leave entirely. Marcus reached me first, cutting through the crowd with practiced efficiency, and pulled me into a hug that lasted several seconds, and when he stepped back, his eyes were wet and he said, "I knew you could do this. I always knew." And I had to blink hard to keep from completely losing it. And then Kiara was there, throwing her arms around me and openly crying and saying, "You were perfect, you were so perfect." And I held on to her tightly because she was the one person in this entire building who had seen every moment of struggle and doubt that led to this. Dr. Morrison stayed close, running interference when the conversations got too intense, and at one point, gently suggesting that we should schedule proper media interviews for later in the week when I'd had time to process. And I was grateful for her protection because I was already feeling overwhelmed, and I hadn't even dealt with my family yet. I could see them in my peripheral vision, and my mother had taken several steps toward me, then stopped, then taken a few more steps, and stopped again, like she couldn't decide if she had permission to approach, and my father was still in the wheelchair that a nurse had brought down for him, even though he'd been cleared to walk short distances, and Vanessa stood slightly behind them with her arms crossed and an expression on her face that I couldn't quite read, and my grandmother and aunts were talking to each other in urgent whispers, clearly trying to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. After about 20 minutes, the crowd around me had thinned somewhat as people returned to their work or their appointments, and I finally turned to face my family, and the look on my mother's face was something I'd never seen before, a mixture of shock and confusion and what might have been shame, and she took those final steps toward me and stopped about 3 feet away, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to come closer, and she said, "Maya, we had no idea," and her voice was small and uncertain, nothing like the dismissive tone she'd used every other time she'd spoken to me in the past 2 years. I looked at her, and then at my father, and then at Vanessa, and I felt a strange calm settle over me, because I'd imagined this moment hundreds of times, and now that it was actually happening, I realized I wasn't angry, I was just tired. And I said, "You never asked." And the simplicity of that statement seemed to hit my mother like a physical blow, because her face crumpled, and she pressed her hand to her mouth. My father was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, something that looked like awe mixed with shame, mixed with confusion, and he said, "You did all this? You built all this?" And I nodded and said, "Yes, I built it while working as a medical assistant and teaching myself to code at night. I built it during the 18 months that you told everyone you only had one daughter. I built it while Vanessa was getting celebrated for every single assignment she turned in, and I couldn't even get invited to Thanksgiving." And my voice was steady and calm and factual, because these were simply true statements, not accusations. Vanessa stepped forward, and she looked genuinely shaken in a way I hadn't expected, and she said, "Maya, this is incredible. I had no idea you were doing anything like this. And I turned to look at her directly and said, You didn't know because you never asked? None of you asked? You just assumed I was wasting my life because I didn't follow the path you approved of. And Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, because what could she possibly say? My Aunt Linda approached cautiously and said, Honey, we're so proud of you. And I felt a flash of anger at that because where was that pride 2 years ago or 6 months ago or literally any time before this exact moment? And I said, You weren't proud of me last week. You were embarrassed by me. The only thing that's changed is now you know I'm successful. And my aunt looked stricken and had no response. My grandmother, who had made the comment about, At least one of you made something of yourself, just that morning was standing behind everyone else looking smaller somehow and older. And when our eyes met, she looked away first, and I realized she had no idea what to say to me. I turned back to my mother, who had tears running down her face, and she said, Maya, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry we didn't support you. I'm so sorry we made you feel like you didn't matter. And her apology sounded genuine, but I also knew that she was apologizing now because I'd been publicly validated, not because she'd realized on her own that they'd treated me badly. And I said, You didn't make me feel like I didn't matter. You told me directly that I didn't matter. You excluded me from family events. You told relatives you only had one daughter in school. You let everyone treat me like I was an embarrassment. And each statement was delivered calmly, without raising my voice, because I didn't need to yell. The facts spoke for themselves. My father finally spoke, and his voice was hoarse from the surgery, but also from something else, maybe emotion. And he said, Maya, I don't know what to say. And I looked at him sitting there in his wheelchair, looking smaller and older than I'd ever seen him, and I said, You don't have to say anything right now. You just had surgery, and you need to focus on recovering. And he shook his head and said, No, I need to say this. I was wrong about you. I was completely wrong, and I'm sorry. And the apology hung in the air between us, and I felt something shift in my chest, but I also knew that one apology couldn't erase 2 years of being treated like I didn't matter. I looked at all of them standing there in their little cluster looking lost and uncertain, and I realized I had a choice to make in this moment. I could tell them all to leave and never contact me again, which part of me wanted to do, or I could set boundaries and see if they were capable of respecting them and actually changing. And I took a breath and said, I'm willing to try to rebuild our relationship, but it has to be different. It has to be on terms of mutual respect. And my mother nodded eagerly and said, Yes, anything. We'll do anything. And I continued, That means no more dismissive comments about my choices. No more comparing me to Vanessa. No more excluding me from family events. And no more conditional love that only shows up when I'm successful enough to meet your standards. And each requirement was stated clearly and firmly because I'd spent the past 24 hours thinking about exactly what I needed from them. Vanessa stepped closer, and she looked genuinely uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen, and she said, Maya, I owe you an apology too. I knew they were treating you differently, and I just let it happen because it benefited me. I liked being the favorite, and I didn't question whether it was fair to you. And her admission surprised me because I hadn't expected that level of honesty from her, and I said, Thank you for saying that. That means something. And she nodded, and I could see tears in her eyes. My mother reached out like she wanted to hug me, then stopped herself, uncertain if she had permission, and she said, Can I hug you? And I hesitated for just a moment before nodding, and she wrapped her arms around me and whispered, I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry we made you feel like you weren't enough. And I let her hold me, but I didn't fully relax into it, because trust would have to be rebuilt slowly over time. We stood there in the atrium for another 20 minutes, talking through logistics and boundaries, and my father said he wanted to know about my business and my life, and actually be involved. And Vanessa asked if she could take me to lunch the following week to talk more. And my grandmother apologized for her comment that morning, saying she'd spoken without thinking, which was true, but also not really an excuse. and my aunts stood awkwardly on the periphery, clearly unsure if they were included in this reconciliation. Eventually, Dr. Morrison approached and gently reminded me that I had 2 interview requests waiting, and my family took that as their cue to leave. And my mother kissed my cheek, and my father reached out and squeezed my hand, and Vanessa gave me an awkward side hug. And then they were gone, and I was left standing there feeling emotionally exhausted and raw, but also somehow lighter. Marcus and Kiara stayed with me through the interviews, and afterward the 3 of us went to a quiet restaurant where I finally let myself fall apart a little bit, crying into my appetizer while Kiara rubbed my back, and Marcus kept saying, "You did so good. You handled that perfectly." And I wasn't sure I had handled it perfectly, but I'd handled it honestly, which was all I could do. 3 months later, my life had transformed in ways I couldn't have imagined that day. In the hospital atrium, Mediflow Systems had grown to a team of 12 full-time employees working out of a small office space downtown. We'd secured 3 additional hospital contracts, totaling another $4.7 million in revenue, and I'd been featured in Forbes' 30 Under 30 list in the healthcare technology category, with a photo spread and everything. My relationship with my family was still a work in progress, but it was actually progressing, which surprised me. My mother had started texting me every few days just to check in without any agenda, and she'd attended 2 of my speaking engagements, sitting in the audience and crying proud tears. And my father had taken me to dinner 3 times and spent those dinners asking questions about my business and actually listening to the answers instead of talking over me. Vanessa and I had developed something that almost resembled a real sisterhood. We met for lunch every other week, and she'd stopped posting only about her own achievements and had actually shared one of my Forbes photos on her Instagram with a caption about being proud of her sister. And while part of me was cynical about the timing of her pride, I also recognized that she was genuinely trying to change. The most important thing I'd learned through all of this wasn't about business success or family reconciliation. It was about the fundamental truth that my worth had never been dependent on their recognition. I had built something meaningful and valuable while they weren't watching. I had proven to myself that I was capable and talented and worthy of success, and that knowledge was mine regardless of whether they ever acknowledged it. I still had moments of anger when I thought about those 2 years of exclusion and dismissal, still felt the sting of every cruel comment, and every time I'd been left out. But I was learning to hold both things at once, the pain of how they'd treated me and the possibility of a different future. And I was learning that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or pretending it hadn't hurt. It meant choosing not to let their past failures define my present. On a Thursday afternoon in June, I sat in my office looking at the incorporation papers for Mediflow's expansion into patient communication systems, and my phone rang with a call from my father, and when I answered, he said, "Hi, Maya. I was wondering if you'd come to dinner on Sunday. Your mother's making that pasta you used to like." And it was such a small, ordinary invitation, but it meant everything, because it meant I was being included without having to prove anything first. And I said yes, I'd be there. And after we hung up, I sat there for a moment feeling the full weight of how far I'd come from that family dinner 2 years ago, when I'd been the disappointment and the cautionary tale. I had built an empire while they weren't watching, and that empire was entirely mine. The success belonged to me, and the journey belonged to me, and the knowledge of my own capability belonged to me, and now they wanted to be part of my life, but I understood finally and completely that I didn't need them to be. I wanted to try because family mattered to me, but I would be fine either way. And that clarity was the most valuable thing I'd gained from this entire experience. More valuable than any contract, or Forbes feature, or public vindication. The knowledge that I was enough all by myself, and I always had been.